Alright, so I just remembered that my channel's bio says books slash manga slash games enthusiast, and I've only ever talked about games on the channel, which is weird because like books and manga occupy just as much of my time as games do. But I guess I'll change that with today because I wanted to talk about one of my favorite mangas, if not my favorite manga now of all time, which is The Witch and the Mercenary. And it's really weird because it's a relatively new one. I think it came out maybe 2022 sometime. That might be wrong, but it's rarely talked about. It seems to be very niche somehow, even though if it follows a very straightforward premise, but it does that premise extremely well with some of the like most likable characters, some of the most complex like world building I've seen in a manga, and just like its setting and its art. It's just everything is so beautiful. But yeah, I don't really know how this talking about manga thing works on YouTube, so I guess I'll just really go over what I really love about this manga. Keep in mind, this is all from my personal perspective. It could vary, from person to person, obviously. Things I might bring up you might find I guess infuriating if you're not the type of person that usually reads manga, or not the type of manga like this. And so yeah, just keep all of that in mind. This is definitely, it's coming off as a huge bias, but it's something I really loved and wanted to talk about for a while. So yeah, like I said, it's called The Witch and the Mercenary. As you'd expect, it's about a witch and a mercenary. The mercenary, whose name is Zig, he sets out on a quest to take out this outcast witch, and he and his mercenary companions are tasked by the king to go take her out, since in this world, just like many other fantasy worlds, witches are sort of like this fearsome deity who can use magic and their arcane arts to unnatural like degree. And that's basically how chapter 1 is starting, is that we're about to go hunt down this witch, and we see Zig. We're about to see it from his perspective. Zig is a huge guy. Like, this guy has to be like at least 6'8". He's enormous compared to like all the other mercenaries around him. And I remember very specifically him bumping in like to the first person that he meets, another mercenary. The guy is like sort of hostile at first, but then he looks up at Zig and says, "Oh my god, this guy's a fucking giant." And yeah, but Zig is a very like, he's like the strong and burly type of mercenary, obviously, but he has like calm presence about him that's, it's like he's a very aloof kind of personality. Obviously the term that can be used is gentle giant. And so he's like asking all the mercenaries around him, trying to inquire about like, where does witch come from? Why does the king exactly want her dead? And right away from chapter 1, this is something that I really loved about Zig's character, and that sets him apart from other mercenaries or adventurers in this world, is that he likes to acquire as much information as humanly possible on things that he's not very familiar with, such as like different type of monsters, or again, witches, because he's never had to deal with witches in the past. So he just keeps asking a lot of questions to the other mercenaries in the group, and they're, giving him the information he needs to, properly equip himself or to be prepared for the fight that's ahead. And it's something that's very subtle. It's done very subtly over the entire series. And to me, it depicts Zig as this kind of guy who likes to be as prepared as humanly possible when heading off into any job. But we then go to head off to, kill the witch. And so Zig, is with the whole other band of mercenaries, but he himself can tell that something's not right, something is off, as they finally arrive to go deal with the witch. And he was right. This witch can, just use all sorts of different kind of magic. These spears that like shoot up out of the ground and impale their target. And yeah, so then the witch just completely massacres everyone else but Zig because he's able to detect it in time. And then it's Zig against the witch. Although the witch is quite skilled and is really good at using the environment to her advantage, Zig is just too good at close quarters combat, and he gets a jump on her, and he makes her surrender, and she's just ready to die at that point. Her entire life has been lived in isolation because everyone again in this world is just thinking that witches are evil and horrible beings. But Zig realizes that she is just like him in the way that like mercenaries are only used as tools to do like the king's bidding, or like these leadership's bidding. So he feels some sympathy for her, and then he lets her go. But the witch understands that she will never really be safe, and she questions Zig at first. She's like, wouldn't it just make more sense to take my head back to the king and show him that you killed me? And Zig's like, well, that wouldn't work, because say I am the only one who survives out of this entire mercenary group, and I take this random head back to the king saying that, oh, here's the witch, oh, I killed the witch, it could just be a random woman's head. And also, the king's son went on this expedition with Zig and his mercenary group to go hunt down the witch for experience. And of course, he died and he didn't make it back. So, in best case scenario is that Zig gets hanged and killed off like the rest of them. Or, worst case scenario, he's like flogged in public and set as an example as to what happens when you try to like sort of trick the king. Or at least that's what would be the implication if Zig is the only one to survive and bring her head back. So they both come to an understanding that just wouldn't work, and he just spares her. But of course, she understands that she'll never actually be like truly free in this world that just always tries to hunt down any and every witch. And so she tasks him with another proposition. Does that make any sense? She offers him another proposition that, why don't you be my bodyguard instead and help me get away from this continent of, these people who are constantly trying to hunt me down. And Zig at first is very like apprehensive about the idea. He's like, first off, can you pay me? Like, can you, like, you live in isolation, can you pay me at all? And she can, because she's a witch or whatever. She just, pulls out a bag of gems. So she can. But Zig at first, he's very sort of, cautious about it, because he's like, well, nowhere on this continent is going to be safe enough for you to be able to live freely. So he said, let's travel to the other continent then, which they had to cross over this sea to get there. And no one knows, at least on this continent that they are on right now, no one knows what the other continent actually looks like. So it's, it's a very high risk that over there can just be nothing but monsters. But he and the witch understands that they had to take that chance. And although Zig is very, he's very apprehensive about the idea, he can see that the witch is basically at her wit's end. Like, she's lived all this time by herself, constantly being hunted down. It wears on her just like it would anyone, and she's not as evil as she's made out to be. So he, again, just takes pity on her, but he also understands that it's still just a job. So she pays him, and he does take the job. And then they make their journey off to, heading off to the other continent to see if they can find a safe place for her to live for the rest of her life. So Zig the mercenary and Siyasha the witch head off to the other continent to see if there's possibly any other civilization or just like free land out there that she can go live off in peace. And that's basically where chapter 1 and like 2-ish ends. And I'm not going to go over the entire like story or whatever, but that's basically how the story starts. But to me, the story essentially follows the progression with like a sense of urgency that doesn't detract from the overall world building, which is like one of my favorite points. Is that by like the first 3 or 4 volumes, it is so well layered. It reminds me of like Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy. For those who don't read fantasy much, he basically executes like character dynamics and a really good world building style, and it blends together extremely well. Of course, like I said, the story's not like super ambitious or anything, but they don't really beat around the bush with how each event kind of takes place. It's sort of like it starts with the bounty and then the rescue and then like bodyguard activities, and then there's a lot of adventuring that they do on this other continent, and then also exploring they do of this other continent that they had no idea had such a big civilization. There's this whole civilization on this other side of the continent that is very different from what they're used to, especially Zig himself. So again, of course, as you'd expect, he tries to get a lot of information on this continent and how the rules of this place that they're in works. But I feel like Zig and Siyasha contrast very well with each other. Zig is like this very stoic, very burly type character, and Siyasha, she's very curious about everything, because again, she's lived in isolation her entire life. So she's very curious about everything that she comes across. She looks very happy, obviously, to not have to live in isolation and constantly be scared and in fear of her life. And to me, it just works very well together. But I also understand that she needs to set herself up to be able to eventually live on her own without Zig, because this is still just a job. So they go to this new continent. There's like an adventurers guild, and they go there, and Siyasha signs up as an adventurer with Zig as sort of like a sort of semi-adventurer, but still just her bodyguard. And of course, Siyasha being a witch, but also just very good at using magic, which is very prevalent on this continent. She draws a lot of eyes from a lot of other adventurer parties who may want to recruit her, but also they're just sort of like scared to approach her, because again, Zig is like this like big giant essentially that is just like hovering over her. so people understand to sort of like keep their distance. But the other adventuring parties are not like just completely incompetent. This is something that I really like about this manga as well, is that for a lot of other mangas, they feel like in order to promote the protagonist of the story, you need to dumb down everyone else to be complete morons. And that's not what happens in the story. It just is that Zig is so much more meticulous about, his information gathering and about, being on top of, just being prepared for any and everything that might come their way while out on jobs. But, the other adventurers, they are still like the A-ranked adventurers. They are still very competent people. So when you see them out on their jobs, they're still able to handle themselves quite well. And that's something that I really like, is that it doesn't dumb down the rest of the people in the world in order to boost up Zig and Siyasha. Now, that's not to say that people don't try to test them. People obviously try to, see what limits they can push. Like other adventurers, they see what limits they can push with Zig. But for the most part, most of the people that they run to are very helpful and welcoming of both Zig and Siyasha. And that's also something that I really like about this manga, is that it doesn't feel the need to be antagonistic 24/7 or just to have animosity there all the time. Like for most other mangas, like, kicked from the hero party mangas, we've all seen that there's like hundreds of titles like that. And it seems like everyone in all of the parties is just completely incompetent, but like I said, antagonize the protagonist 24/7. And that's something that I liked. It wasn't necessarily needed in this one, and was more so on the side of like, there's just very cool and interesting monsters and very dangerous and unknown monsters out there that can take up that role, and it doesn't have to be a lot of like infighting amongst other adventurers. Of course, no one on this new content really understands just how powerful Zig or Siyasha actually are. As a matter of fact, Zig fights one of the, it's like a dark elf character. She's like a ninja like character, but she's an S rank adventurer if I remember correctly. She's like one of 10. And Zig, even though it was a hard fought battle, he ends up taking her down, but he doesn't kill her again because it would affect Siyasha's like relationships with other adventurers, and so he doesn't kill her. Instead, he just spares her. But it just goes to show that people on this continent don't really understand just how powerful Zig and Siyasha actually are. And Zig and Siyasha understand that just coming out of nowhere and all of a sudden becoming like incredibly powerful S-rank adventurers in this new place would raise a lot of eyebrows. So instead, they take the slow and steady approach and, work their way up the ranks. And as they go, they discover new monsters, they discover new spells, they discover a lot more about this continent that's just very different from what they knew before. And again, this is what makes the world building so great in this manga, because the more that Zig and Siyasha learn about this other continent and just the world in general, the more that we learn. So it's like unraveling it as we go. Now, you might be wondering why it just sort of feels like we jumped right into the middle of a story. And it's kind of because we have, to be honest. Like, of course, we don't know much about Siyasha's backstory, but I mean, it's not too hard to figure out that she's an outcast because she's a witch, right? Self-explanatory. And Zig, from his like work and experience as a mercenary, we don't know too much about, like what he's gone through over the years. But we did get a pretty nice backstory in volume 3. They showed Zig as a kid. He was an orphaned kid, which kind of makes sense because he's a mercenary. And it shows his like journey from being a mercenary. And from a very early age, you can tell he is a very determined kid and a very determined individual. Even when it seems like something's not possible for him to do, he will force himself to be determined enough to overcome that obstacle. And it's something that's carried, he's carried forward with them. And it really shows why he became the person he is today. And I think this volume has volume 3 has some of the best art in the entire manga, and probably of any manga I've ever read. It is unbelievably beautiful. I don't want to spoil too much of the story beyond this. That's why I'm kind of talking vaguely. But it looks so good in certain moments, and when certain things happen and the art pops off, it is just unbelievable. I would just sit there for like a minute looking at a single panel with some of the most beautiful art I've ever seen in my life. And the art just keeps looking better and better as time goes on. It actually mind blows me that this is, I believe it's bi-weekly, and it reminds me a lot of like Dun Dun Dun, how I'm still like in shock that is released weekly. It has some art that should be in a monthly manga, and it looks as good as it does, and this one does as well. It looks incredible. Another thing I really love about this manga is it's just really balanced across the board. Like, instead of like the certain tropes being over the top, it's more so balanced and calm, sort of like Freeman style. And there is a fair bit of action, to be honest, but it's not like super grim dark. The intensity of the fights, they're incredible. and the fight panels, they look amazing. But again, it's not like too dark. It doesn't go too far one way or too far the other way. It's not like a super, comedy sort of like isekai, and it's not also like, it's not berserk. It just sits somewhere in the middle, and it just has a bit of everything without being too over the top in any one direction. Again, it has quite a bit of action, to be honest, and I love the action that's in the manga. I love the art panels on, with the action and fight scenes. But it also has a little bit of comedy. Again, it has a bit of exploring and adventuring. It just has a bit of everything, and it's all balanced extremely well, and it's done extremely well. I would say the main thing I love about this manga, though, is Zig as a character himself, because we see him start out as a sort of like, again, this is not like some sort of revolutionary, like plot or anything, but it sort of starts out as him being very stoic, very, moody type character, and obviously he's being opened up by Siyasha and just his other continent and other adventurers who are very welcoming and friendly to him, which he's not used to being in the mercenary business. And it's, to me, it's very heartwarming to see. Some people might think that Zig is just too emotionless, or that he's just too stoic. To me, that is just like how the manga starts out with his like character progression. I feel like his character progression has gone really well throughout the first 4 volumes. He's nothing like Tatsuya from what's that light novel? The Irregular High School, whatever. I've only read the first couple of volumes, but just completely stoic, emotionless, and just like so badass and macho, and it just never changes. The same goes with Classroom of the Elite, Ayana Koji. Just, very edgy kind of MCs that are good in their own way, but they have almost no character progression at all. With Zig, you can already see the cracks sort of start to form in his armor of like, do I just strictly keep a job, or allow myself to sort of care for Siyasha in a personal capacity? And I feel like the character progression throughout the first 4 volumes has been paced incredibly well, with the story as well. The story is paced incredibly well. Again, it just, with a lot of like weekly and bi-weekly manga, I usually feel like there's obvious stopping points where it's like, okay, yeah, it obviously stops here. Whereas when I'm reading The Witch and the Mercenary, when I get to the end of the page, I'm like, wait, that was it? Like, because it feels like it's such a continuation of the story with no obvious stopgaps. But all of this vagueness and rambling is to say that I think The Witch and the Mercenary is a very, very underrated manga, and an incredible manga read at that. It's one of those manga I would recommend to people who don't read manga or watch anime, and can get them into, sort of that culture immediately without being like weirded out from some of the other weird ass isekai slop that's out there. But yeah, it's very incredible all around. I think everything is 10 out of 10. I don't think there's a single flaw with this manga. Like, up to this point, 42 chapters in, 4 volumes in, I don't think I've found a single flaw or something that I've not absolutely loved in the story. And you know what? Honestly, hopefully it stays that way, because I've read manga in the past where I'm reaching volume 10 and 11 and 12, and all of a sudden it just falls off a cliff in terms of like quality of the writing and I don't want to say necessarily the art, but like, the art doesn't look as good as it could be, and it starts to disappoint me after a while. But for this one, hopefully it shows no signs of slowing down. Actually, it just shows signs of improving and increasing in quality. So I hope that it just continues to do that, and I can just continue to gush over what's probably my favorite manga of all time right now. As I sit here, of all the like 150 manga that I read, this is my favorite, hands down. It's not even close. But anyways, all of this rambling and vagueness to say that I think that The Witch and the Mercenary is an incredibly good manga. If you haven't read it already, give it a try. Unfortunately, I think the only books 1 are out in terms of like the manga books. The light novel, I think it goes up to books 6 or 7. But yeah, I bought all of those and I've read all of those. So yeah, it's on Amazon, or I think it's also on Bookwalker. If you want, I'll put links in the description if you're interested. I'm not really sure who's gonna see this video. Maybe no one, to be honest. Maybe I'm talking to myself. But if anyone does see this video and has read The Witch and the Mercenary, tell me what you think of it, and tell me some of the things you may like or dislike about it, and leave that in the comments below. But yeah, anyways, I'm gonna stop rambling, and that's it for me. I'll see you next time.